can't really do a whole lot about it until you change what the input is, what the documents that we're feeding something like this.
Welcome to the Contract Teardown Show from Law Insider, where legal experts tear down contracts from some of the most well-known companies and high-profile executives around the world.
In this episode, lawyer and legal technology entrepreneur Justin MacFayden tears down the publication rules in OpenAI's terms of service. Justin points to OpenAI's mixed goals of creating a sharing culture while having to impose some ethical and legal limits. Contracts can often stand in the way of goals of a company like OpenAI, so let's tear it down. Hey everybody, welcome back to the Contract Teardown Show from Law Insider. I'm Mike Whalen. The purpose in the show is exactly what it sounds like. We take contracts, we beat them up, we say mean things, we make them feel bad about themselves, occasionally supporting at the end, just to give that little bit of life. I'm here with my friend Justin MacFayden. Justin, how are you today?
I'm doing very well, Mike. Thank you.
I appreciate you being here, Justin. We are going to go down a nerdy rabbit hole. Why? Because we were talking about this document. This is the GTP3 Terms of Service, which is a whole sentence. I don't know what any of that means. We're going to talk about that. Justin, why are we talking through this document? What's important about this social media policy and its relationship to GTP3?
So this is a section of OpenAI's terms of use, and OpenAI are the people behind GPT-3, which is a huge topic in the AI and machine learning community. And OpenAI is actually one of Elon Musk's offspring, so you can do with that what you will.
Okay, I just want to point out that I, to this moment, don't know whether it's GTP3 or GPT-3 because you've messed it up. I just want to point out to the listening audience, Justin said, is it GPT-3?
That's right. GPT. Okay. Yes.
This will
Generative
start the
pre-trained transformer.
Exactly. This is going to start the series of dumb questions that I'm going to ask about it. First, generative. What did you say?
Pre-trained transformer.
All right. And what is before we get into this document and what this thing is? Let's ask some dumb questions about this. One is, what is generative, et cetera, et cetera?
So GPT-3 is one of the most powerful deep learning language models. So to give you some context, think it's Siri, but on steroids. It costs them about $10 million to train it. It uses 175 billion parameters. So they've taken all of Wikipedia, a huge library of books, and a big chunk of just the internet generally, and they've fed it to a machine. And it can do some really impressive, somewhat disturbing and compelling things. It can write songs and stories and essays. And we can imagine that eventually it could enable contract drafting, machine learning enabled contract drafting.
Right.
And its use in legal tech is what brought me to begin playing with it.
Yeah, so I wanted to ask you about your background and how you are part of the group that is turning computers into overlords that we will all be subject to. Why is this your fault? What do you do for a job?
Absolutely. So I got my law degree from UC Hastings in San Francisco. So I think working in tech was almost obligatory. In my second year at Hastings, I started really getting into legal tech and trying to build my career around that more than a traditional law practice. And then I went to study legal tech in Copenhagen for a semester. And when I came back, I found a legal tech startup. It was called Prose Claims. And it was a pretty antagonistic approach to settling personal injury claims. About a year in, I sold the company to a Canadian partner called Painworth. I've been working with them to bring their product to the US. I've also been working with the folks at A2J Tech, which is as a legal innovator. And that's been a lot of fun. They're a really great team building awesome legal tech. And now I live in LA and I'm building out a chapter of LA Legal Hackers. So any legal tech heads out there, feel free to reach out. And I am a machine learning natural language processing enthusiast, which is why I'm here today to talk about this contract.
Yeah, really fun at parties. So do for me as we pivot into this actual document, because we do like to root these conversations in the documents. Structure for me real simply the relationship between GPT-3 and this particular policy and OpenAI. What's the relationship between this document and the technology?
Absolutely. So OpenAI has made GPT-3 available for people to test and play with for about a year and a half now. And they've made their API available for people to implement in various experiments and in processes if they choose to do that. What's interesting about this particular section of their terms of use is that it limits, I think, pretty severely what you can and can't share as far as the outputs. So what you've done with this, the experiments you've run, you can't just show them to people. There are limits around what you can do with it, and there are a lot of reasons for that, which I think we'll explore.
Hey everybody, I'm Mike Whalen. I hope you're enjoying this episode of the Contract Teardown Show. Real quick, I want to ask you to do me/you really a quick favor. Look down below. You'll see a discount code to join the Law Insider Premium subscription. When you do that, you get access to more content like this. You'll see webinars, daily tips on contract drafting, not to mention access to the world's largest database of sample contracts and clauses. It will help you write better contracts faster. If you want to do it right now, there's a code below, so get there. Also, if you're part of a larger team, if you're in-house or in a law firm, just email us. We're at sales@lawinsider.com. We'll make sure you get a deal as well. Come join us in the community. The code is below. Let's get back to the show. So OpenAI made it available, but then said, if you go build the Death Star with it, there's going to be consequences. So we'll jump into the limits on this document. We'll start at the beginning with the social media policy, talking about mitigating possible risks of combining AI-generated content with social media. First, it's making a recognition of the risks. What about this section? Do you like the background context that they're giving by saying, here's the human reality as we move into making you behave?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, from reading this entire document, you kind of get a sense of, that they're creating limitations around GPT-3 generated content and what you can share. And I think there are a lot of reasons for taking this really sensitive approach that they've done. This opening section, like you said, it talks about the risks, but they aren't exactly clear what they mean by the risks of using this language model, right? We've
all seen the Terminator. We know what the risks are, okay?
Exactly, right. And interestingly, they note in the very next sentence after mentioning the risks, we have updated these social media policies to be slightly more permissive than they were previously. So even though they're pretty restrictive terms now, they've apparently eased up. But yeah, to get back to the risks, I think I didn't plan on getting into philosophical chats so early, but I do think it's important to touch on what their general concern is here with this entire document and what they mean. Yeah. So AI ethicists are very concerned about the risks of language models this powerful. Like you said, for Terminator-like scenarios, certainly, but really at the more severe end of their concerns are things like spam bots or fake news bots swaying elections around the world. Academic plagiarism is another big one. This thing could write essays for you. But I think the big risk in going through this that OpenAI is mostly concerned about is outputs that are racist or sexist or use some kind of profanity, right? So they have a playground that has a built-in content filter, which rates the output as unsafe or sensitive, and it warns users that there may be toxic content in the output. And this content filter is incredibly sensitive. So it's mostly false positives. I generated about 50 outputs, and almost every single one was flagged as being toxic. Maybe 2 out of the 50 actually contain something that might be considered toxic or objectionable. So it's something that it's very front of mind for them. And actually this definition of risk or what the concerns are by the team at OpenAI is actually one of the very interesting bits to me, right? The fact that the team at OpenAI are working very hard to solve this specific problem of toxic outputs. Right. So I'd mentioned that the GPT-3 was trained on data from the internet, right? Data that was created by us. So in a sense, when you have a chat experience or, if they created a chat bot with GPT-3, it's like you're speaking to the internet, right? Which means that the content that we create is quite toxic. So the language models that are trained on our content are also toxic, right? So, aside
let me get a use case. So we're going to talk about it makes a distinction between occasional one-off postings of prompts in the first section. In the second section, it talks about more frequent ongoing posting of prompts. So in terms of like how one might use this thing. So if I'm a lawyer and I'm advising somebody who's got a technology company or a media company or whatever, they're trying to be out in the universe, what is the distinction between these two kinds of categories? Is the purpose in this thing maybe in a business case as an end use for this company to say, you know what, we need to post on social media. It's a thing that easily gets screwed up, but it doesn't offer a whole lot of value. So we're going to give it to this tool by feeding some things and then looking at the outputs. Is that the use case that drives somebody to this?
I think that the big concern from the folks at OpenAI is that they don't. I mean, it comes down to a public image thing. Not to be cynical about it, but I think OpenAI doesn't want to be known as creators of this hateful, racist machine. So they want to limit the sharing of the kind of content that would be considered hateful or racist to the best of their ability, without anything else to really compare to as far as documents that are like this. I think this document is a pretty effective means of doing that and trying to limit the sharing.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because as using the document as social nudging to try to get the people who, it's terms of use, right? But to get them to use it in a way they seem to recognize we actually don't have much power in the way that you use this thing. If you look under that occasional one-off posting of prompts, they set some rules. They even define a rule of thumb as to what falls under that category. But the last bullet point on there, we kindly ask you to refrain from sharing outputs that may offend others, et cetera, et cetera. You don't see a lot of contract language that says, we kindly ask you to refrain. There seems to be a recognition of a lack of control here.
That's really interesting that you noticed that, because that was one of the big criticisms, I guess, that I could have of this document is enforceability. And later on in the document, when they talk about live streaming, they say, for other events, you may conduct unrecorded live demonstrations for audiences of less than 25 people from various organizations, or for any amount of people from one organization. Again, provided that you clarify that the application has not yet been approved for launch. So that feels to me completely impossible to enforce, right? I can imagine being able to enforce some of the social media sharing. If the team at OpenAI sees that you're doing this, they can do something about it. But with presentations to private groups, I think that's tough. So there is, like you said, a lot of nudging and kindly asking you not to share offensive outputs. Well,
and to get to the next section that's talking about the more frequent use, there's a link, which is always a thing in documents like this. There's a link to something called Prelaunch review. Do you know what that process is? How is the company now getting re-involved and saying, let's have a review before you go publish the thing?
So I haven't gone deep into what the pre-launch review actually looks like. I imagine that you essentially submit the work to them, the things that you want to do with it, and I'm imagining have pretty broad discretion. I would imagine that they don't define clearly exactly the categories of things that they would approve or disapprove of. But again, I think that the focus for them is just what they would consider toxic outputs. So as long as what you're doing looks well upon GPT-3 and the folks at OpenAI, I think they'd probably.
Yeah, you see another bullet point with another hyperlink. It says content is filtered to avoid unsafe content. Content where our content filter returns a 2 equals unsafe. If you are using OpenAI Codex and have not implemented the content filter, you should refrain from posting content containing slurs or offensive language, etc. They have a process, it seems, but even when they do, they're using terms like should to encourage different behavior. If we jump down to the fictional content co-authored with the OpenAI API policy, what are you seeing in that section that stands out to you?
So I kind of mentioned that plagiarism is one of the potential ethical concerns for them. So GPT-3 can certainly write essays. It can write fictional stories. So I think part of this section is explaining to you just another interesting thing that GPT-3 can do. But they also give you a boilerplate disclaimer to add to anything alongside GPT-3. outputs. So I think that's incredibly thoughtful. And it tells me that that they do want people playing with it, right? And they do want you showing people, they do want, right? I mean, from a marketing standpoint, they do want people messing around with this. They do want people sharing the outputs and showing that you can do really cool things with GPT-3. But again, they want you showing nothing naughty. That is an output from GPT-3.
Yeah, and they even give you stock language that you can use to describe the creative process, provided it is accurate. Quote, the author generated this text in part with GPT-3, et cetera, et cetera. So they give you a disclaimer. It reminds me of a conversation that we had previously had with Bob Tarantino about the Dungeons and Dragons, about the open policy that they have for creating content, and that this sort of disclaimer, this sort of stock language has to travel with that kind of content or you're in violation. Going down to the research policy, there's a note here about raising IP considerations. Anything to say on that section? This is under we do require that researchers receive prior approval, et cetera, in that section. Any idea about IP considerations with this kind of document?
So speaking not as an IP expert, but I think it is a really interesting forefront of intellectual property, the idea of ownership of AI generated materials, right? I think there's definitely something to be said about that. It's an interesting area of law. I think there are some compelling issues that are going to arise from novels which are written in conjunction with GPT-3 and other language models like it. But I think it's, they're speaking to, as far as I know, untrodden territory in intellectual property law.
Thinking about big principles as we sort of shift out of the document, I was watching a TED Talk that was talking about massive online collaboration, and it was the researcher who came up with the CAPTCHA thing, and he was talking about how CAPTCHA, like the original version, was just an annoyance. It was just solving a problem. And then reCAPTCHA, the second thing, was about encoding books. They were using people spending these little 10 seconds of time to try to fix a book. That same guy then went and created Duolingo, which encodes a bunch of the internet in multiple languages through people learning a language. And what was interesting about that conversation was he was looking for massive online collaboration, right? Which is what, that's the ethos behind a thing like OpenAI, to try to get people to go use this. But once you do, it's very Wild Westy. And these guys are trying to figure out, okay, how do we put some kind of constraints on that? With Duolingo, it's a whole app. It's a structure that the tool itself puts constraints on the way that's used. But with this kind of really open culture in technology, thinking about what lawyers do to put constraints around something whose value is the Wild Westiness. Talk to me about that. How do we balance that as lawyers in terms of, putting some kind of constraints, but without totally killing the purpose?
Absolutely. Well, I think OpenAI does this pretty well. I think they take it head on, right? So they've written papers about the limitations of GPT-3 and some of the issues that we talked about. So certainly the toxic outputs, which they're trying to deal with by using these content filters and saying, hey, just so you know, when you come to our platform, you can use it. Yeah. And you should share it with people, but also please be careful about the way that you use it and how you share it with people. But one of the interesting things that they've mentioned in a paper is, aside from the obviously toxic outputs, are the biases that we find with people echoed in GPT-3, and you can't really filter that out, right? So some of the examples that they've given are people will give it a prompt like the word man, right? And it'll say things like lazy and large and protect and survive. And if you give it the prompt woman, it'll output things like petite and gorgeous and bubbly, right? So there's this entrenched bias, which is something that you can't really content filter out in the same way that you could for naughty words, right? And this is really the core of a statistical relevance algorithm like this. You can't really do a whole lot about it until you change what the input is, what the documents that we're feeding something like this is. So, they're tackling, I think, a really big question and putting something out there for people to play with. And I think this document does pretty well as far as writing that line, however unenforceable most of the clauses might be.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting thing because you start to think about the power of contract to be able to control the kinds of transactions that are tiny and disperse and, not human to human. There are obviously limits on what contract can do as a social control tool, as a tool that enables collaboration between people who otherwise have no relationship, right? I mean, that's what transactions are, is, contract is enabling cooperation between people who don't necessarily have a reason to cooperate. They're not in the same tribe or whatever. But, how does that overlap to the Skynet world where everybody's involved? They're doing little bits. They're interesting questions to ponder. And certainly in this short little teardown, we're not going to solve all those world problems. But Justin, if people want to reach out to you and actually figure out how to prevent Arnold Schwarzenegger coming back and killing all of them, what's the best way to connect with you?
I'm on Twitter. You can find me, Justin MacFayden. I don't post much, but feel free to reach out to me on there. I love legal tech and I love talking about these issues. So hit me up.
Awesome. We'll do that. We'll include in the resources page on this video all of the documents that we've talked about and some context and also contact information for Justin. So if you just go to lawinsider.com/resources, you'll be able to find it there when it's up. And if you want to be on the Contract Teardown Show to beat up a contract and be mean to it, just email us. We're at community@lawinsider.com. We'll see you guys next time. Thanks again, Justin. Y'all have a good day.
Thanks, Mike.